Hello philosophers, and welcome back as we get ready for some medieval philosophy. Now, personally, I love studying, I love teaching medieval philosophy. It's one of my favorite eras of thought, and I think it's one that's very often misunderstood. We often use this phrase or this terminology of the Dark Ages as a way of saying that, these are just primitive, superstitious people who don't really know anything compared to us who live on this side of the so-called Enlightenment. But I just don't think that's at all true. In fact, I think there's a lot of wisdom there that a lot of times that we miss in our current context, especially if we look upon them with arrogance. Now, despite the fact that there is a lot of robust philosophical conversation happening in the medieval period, for the purposes of this course, we have to keep things rather brief, and so we're just going to look at two sources. And both of them are fairly early medieval sources. The first one's going to be St. Augustine, who is a Christian theologian and philosopher, one of the most important figures for certainly Christian thought, both Catholic and Protestant, but also he is one of the most important figures in the history of Western thought, as are really most of the people that we're discussing this semester. And in particular, I'm having you read just a short little reading where he deals with what is called a just war doctrine. And so Augustine is talking about when war might be justified, and of course, in turn, when it isn't justified. And this is very important because Augustine's doctrine of just war was used and very arguably misused extensively through the history of the West. And so it's worth digging into that a little bit, as well as the fact that this is really a perennial question, right? When is violence justified? And when is state-sanctioned violence justified? Or is it ever justified? And these are things that you're going to grapple with as you read St. Augustine. And then next, in the longer text for this week, comes from Boethius. So Boethius was around a little bit after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and so at this point you have the Gothic, the barbarian king ruling in Rome, while Boethius himself is a Roman by culture and by birth. Boethius had a prosperous career, even working with this barbarian king. However, eventually fortunes turned against him, and he was falsely accused of sedition against the king, and he was imprisoned and eventually executed. And while he's imprisoned, awaiting his final sentencing, Boethius is just meditating on his relationship to fortune, recognizing that he feels like, from his perspective at least, he did everything right. This was a man of virtue, a man of reason. By any reasonable standard, this was a good man who had received good things for his good behavior, for his good actions, but now it was all taken away through no fault of his own. And so he's left wondering, was it even worth it? What is goodness? What's the point of virtue? How do I maintain my relationship with virtue? How do I maintain my relationship with goodness and with hope when so much of life seems to just be outside of my control? And so Boethius is dealing with some questions that you've probably likely asked in your own life. When things are just taken away from you through no apparent fault of your own, or when things just go your way, right? There's a lot of good that you have that you didn't necessarily earn, that you didn't necessarily acquire, but just kind of happened through the positive spin of fortune in your life. And so in the good times and the bad times, how do we separate ourselves out from changing fortunes and anchor ourselves in realities that are enduringly good and true and beautiful? How do we find that in the bright days as well as the darkest nights? I love this text, and I would encourage you at some point to read the entire Consolation of Philosophy. But for this course, I'm really requiring that you read Book 1. And so it's really just the opening section here that's going to give you a taste for the things he's grappling with. You're going to start to see some answers emerge, and you'll get just a kind of a feel for how medievals thought and how they operated. Now, I can't necessarily testify for the translation that I'm including on Canvas. Honestly, I included it because it looked like it was one of the easier to read ones, and it was available for free online. But if you want to read it on your own, I recommend picking up a print edition. For what it's worth, I like the Penguin edition, and so that's just something that you can keep in mind. Well, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for now, but keep in mind that we do have our next Zoom meeting on Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and that's going to be a good time just to answer any questions you may have, to talk about the things that have stood out to you, insights you might have, things you struggled with, things you've liked, things you didn't like, and I really hope to see you there. Until next time, Godspeed.